So I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we will invite them to the stage. James Carafano is Vice President of National Security and Foreign Policy at the Heritage Foundation. Before assuming responsibility for Heritage's entire defense and foreign policy team 10 years ago, he had served as Deputy Director of the Davis Institute, as well as Director of its Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies since 2009 at the Heritage Foundation. He's an accomplished historian and teacher, as well as a prolific writer and researcher. His most recent publication is called Brutal War, which was published last year, a study of combat in the Southwest Pacific. James's most recent research has focused on developing the national security required to secure the long-term interests of the U.S., protecting the public, providing for economic growth, and preserving civil liberties. And he spoke at the Freedom Conference last summer in Beaver Creek, so we're very pleased to welcome him back. New to the Steamboat Institute as a speaker is Professor Lakshman Guruswamy. He is Professor of International Environmental Law Emeritus at CU Boulder. He is an internationally recognized expert in international, environmental, and global energy law. He was born in Sri Lanka. Prior to joining CU, Professor Guruswamy taught in Sri Lanka, the UK, and the universities of Iowa and Arizona. At CU, he teaches international environmental law, global energy justice, oil and international relations, and international law. He is widely published and is a frequent speaker at scholarly meetings around the U.S. and the world. He is the author of Global Energy Justice, Law and Policy, published in 2016. He has authored over 50 scholarly articles published in law reviews and other peer-reviewed journals, and was the recipient of the 2016 Senior Scholar Award granted by the Environmental Academy of the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. The panel will be moderated by Philip Wegmann, who many of you know if you attend Steamboat Institute events. Philip Wegmann is White House correspondent for Real Clear Politics. He previously wrote for the Washington Examiner and has done investigative reporting on congressional corruption and institutional malfeasance. We're very proud he's one of our Tony Blankley Fellows with the Steamboat Institute. Phil can be seen regularly in White House press briefings asking questions of Press Secretary Jen Psaki, that is when she's willing to call on him. Wegmann was a fellow of the America's Future Foundation writing program and a Publius Fellow with the Claremont Institute and an Eagle Scout. Before journalism, he grew up in Indiana and graduated from Hillsdale College. And as I mentioned, we're very proud that Phil is a Tony Blankley Fellow with the Steamboat Institute. Let's give a warm welcome to our panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Can I sit here?
Yes. Well, we don't really have anything to discuss anyway.
Okay, nice.
Oh. Nothing's really going on in the world right now, and there's not really a decent news hook for this conference, so I was really pressed to come up with questions. All kidding aside, according to the U.S. Energy and Information Administration, a gallon of gas in March cost $2.42. Of course, when I say March, I mean March of 2020, and a lot has happened between then and now. A global pandemic, a land war in Europe, and the changing of the presidency. A gallon of gas in March of 2022 now costs on average $4.10. So let's start at the beginning and figure out how we got here. President Biden canceled the Keystone Pipeline on day one of his administration. He ordered a pause on all new oil and natural gas leases on public land shortly afterwards. And in the first week of his administration, he signed a series of executive orders to make it official that climate change will be at the center of our national security and foreign policy. In fact, the stated goal of all of this, according to the administration, is to reduce U.S. greenhouse gas pollution by 50% by 2030. So, Professor Guruswamy, let's start with you. Was that goal unrealistic? And given that energy is the determining factor of civilization itself, does rushing that kind of transition away from fossil fuels make the kind of pain that we're feeling now for consumers in the country all but inevitable?
So that's a question that requires a few minutes of answering, and I will attempt to do that. Can I get up?
Sure.
Can I stand up? Yeah, because I have a PowerPoint to make. So the first thing that I want to make clear is that I'm coming to this from the perspective of global energy collectivity. And global energy requires justice to the poorest of the poor, as well as the United States. So those are the two polars within which I operate. Now, with regard to energy security, I think I'm going to regurgitate, pull in the strands of a lot of stuff that was said here. I am so privileged to belong to this amazing galaxy of speakers, and to have the ability to talk with them is just wonderful. There is an old saying in Sri Lanka, where I was born, that you don't give a monkey a razor blade and ask it to play the piano. You know, and that you know, you can't do energy security ignoring the role of energy in society. So let me very quickly point out to how this goes. Where's my slide? Is that? No. Is that? The green one, here. It's not. Oh. Oh, yeah. Okay. Huh. Maybe. Is there a problem that I have here? Seems like that, but let me. Okay. Oh. I don't want to take up my time quota by doing this. Yeah. You know, energy is the primary let me go on without this till somebody fixes this for me. Energy is a primary determinant of human progress. This has been pointed out by an amazing galaxy of thinkers spanning the physical sciences, the life sciences, engineering, philosophy, and the political sciences. And what they have said, and this is just a wonderful collection of writings, is that without energy, a civilization perishes. And they pointed out that despite the amazing civilizations of the world, in Rome, in Egypt, in China, it was in the 19th century with the discovery of coal, a fossil fuel, that the countries of Western Europe grew to dominance and became the premier dominant powers of the world. And how did they do it? They harnessed coal that was in the ground to do jobs for them. And the harnessing of energy to do the work that humans would otherwise do explains why some societies flourish and others perish. So the first question that we have to ask ourselves is, what is it that the United States is doing with regard to energy? And we see that it's relying on energy for a whole host of services. We are relying on energy for transport. We are relying on energy for health. We are relying on energy for agriculture. We are relying on energy for petrochemicals. And if you think that energy is only used for vehicles, you'll be mistaken. Because while we might think in the US that we don't need to rely on the internal combustion engine, around the world, the use of the internal combustion engine is rising in large numbers. And so we've got to understand that oil and energy is going to be around to power the future of this country in terms of transportation. Now, I want to leave just one other question with regard to petrochemicals. People forget the extent to which every aspect of what we are and what we do is touched by petrochemicals. I'm looking at this thing that didn't work, my clicker, and it doesn't work without oil. It's the derivatives of oil, the petrochemical industry, that touches every part of the world. And the International Energy Agency, it's not by any means a conservative organization. It was set up by the Organization of Economic and OECD for the purposes of looking at energy. And they put out a very important report in 2018 saying, if you think that oil is going to be used just for transport, think again. By 2030, they think, 30% of the oil we create is going to be used for petrochemicals. And 50% is going to be used in 2050 for petrochemicals. So if we rely on petrochemicals, yes, it is possible to argue that you should go to biochemicals, but that's nowhere in the horizon as far as I can see, then it would be foolhardy. It would be the monkey on the keyboard with the razor blade to try and say we're going to do away with fossil fuels. Now, it's a privilege to listen to Bjorn Lomborg. He's the best in the world at explaining this. Because he says, yes, there is a place, once you found a cheaper source of fossil fuels, renewals cheaper than fossil fuels, go for it. But at the moment, we don't have that. And so it destabilizes the United States and destabilizes the world to rush into this zero emissions by 2050. It's like a nightmare. And I don't think that it is a path that we should pursue. Thank you.
Thank you. Similar question to you, Professor Carafano, given the rush transition and the goals of the current administration.
Yeah. Well, first of all, this is amazing. You guys are awesome. And this guy is awesome. I mean, Philip is one of the rising stars in American journalism. Steamboat helped start his career. You should both give them a round of applause because they are incredible, really. And I feel really bad for you guys. First of all, I think the Sri Lankan accent is awesome because you should have really good speakers, And my wife forgot to remind me that I should have worn all black, because that's cooler. And I feel bad because I did speak before, but I'm really not a really super important speaker. So I feel bad for you guys because you deserve better. I have actually been a substitute speaker for a lot of important people, if that helps. I have. I have filled in for cabinet secretaries and actually foreign heads of state and senators. And in the most important speaking spot I ever had, I filled in for Kiefer Sutherland. So I don't. Let me talk about the geopolitics of this, because look, let's be honest with ourselves. They're nice people that we've had up here, but they're not Einstein. And the reality is if you look at the science, you can't get there from here. And that's not a secret. It's not like the people in the US government are shocked to discover that going to net zero in 2050 is just absolute lunacy. They know that. And yet, the president came into office and made that the centerpiece of his foreign policy. And I can assure you that that was not rhetoric. That was absolutely, totally, and completely true. We talk to foreign governments all the time, and we have great relationships with all the embassies. And for months, they would say, nobody is returning our phone calls. Nobody in the White House is talking to us. And we asked them, well, what are you doing on? And they would go through every big foreign policy issue, and they would say, well, it's under review, it's under review. And it's true that this administration, if they cared about foreign policy at all, dedicated every single moment to saying, how can we use this to push our climate agenda? And there's a reason for that. And there's only two things in foreign policy that this administration cared about really through the whole first year of office. And that was climate. And the other one was anything related to gender or any range of social issues or any political issues that married their politics inside the United States. So for example, if you'd like to frame the argument of election integrity versus voter fraud as a debate between authoritarianism and democracy, then they were happy to mirror image that ashore overseas. And so for example, if the European Union didn't like certain countries, they were happy to frame that in the same word. Now, why did they pick these two particular issues? And the answer is really simple. Had nothing to do with foreign policy or geopolitics or America's role in the world. And it had everything to do with the simple notion of we really don't care about foreign policy unless we can use that foreign policy to reinforce our domestic priorities. And what does the ambitious cultural, political, social agenda have in common with the energy agenda, which is they both provide the powerful instruments for control over society and transformation over society in the way they want. So the reality is our foreign policy was a reflection of our domestic policy. And how the Ukraine issue has particularly caught them blind is their plan was to park Europe and Russia. Literally, they were going to do nothing. And they were going to outsource all of that to Berlin, Brussels, and Paris. And the reason why they greenlit the Nord Stream 2 project was very simple. It made the Germans happy. And if they were going to do nothing, expect the Germans to take care of everything, then that was fine by them. And US officials actually were going around in forums. They weren't on the record forums, but in public forums. And in America, if you're in a public forum and it's not on the record, it doesn't matter, everybody learns about it anyway. They were publicly saying that if anything happens in Ukraine, it's not our problem. It's Europe's problem, and we don't care. It's not our thing. And they were saying that for a year. And many, many European countries were going to them and saying Nord Stream 2 is a particular problem because it wasn't just an energy project. What you were doing was you were greenlining to the Russians, essentially that you were going back to the strategy of the Obama administration, is that you were disengaging from Europe. So your question about how did this damage us? We can have they were essentially telling Russia that we were disengaging from Europe. And Europeans were essentially telling the US government that in energy blackmail, because Europeans were largely dependent on Russian gas, that you were creating a vulnerable situation where you were essentially making Putin more dangerous, more aggressive, because you were signaling weakness and disengagement. And that was driven by the climate policy, because we thought that climate policy was way more important than dealing with issues of actual physical security and dealing with bad people in the world. And that's how we got where we are.
Given the emphasis on climate change policy that we saw during the first year of the Biden administration, I'd like you to do a quick real-time fact check of something that President Biden told reporters in the Roosevelt Room just last week, where he claimed that, quote, "It's simply not true that my administration or its policies are holding back domestic energy production. That's simply not true."
Well, I think that was nailed in the last couple of panels, right? So, I don't even think that's up for debate. And now what's really interesting is we've created really this incredible moment in history, and the professor can talk about this because he's probably the world's greatest expert on the long term of how these have gone, is now we have two things which are directly pushing against each other, which is on the one hand, a climate agenda that demands certain politics and outcomes which actually work against an agenda of reliable, affordable, abundant energy. And the irony, of course, is the climate agenda, as we've learned today, doesn't actually solve the issue of climate, right? So we have a climate action plan that doesn't solve climate and actually works against the idea of abundant, reliable, affordable energy that address energy security issues. And these issues have now collided head on, right? And as you said, and as the last panel said, the response in this administration so far has been, we're going to buy oil from Venezuela and Iran. So think about this, right? They have done nothing since day one of this crisis, even though they knew this crisis was coming, right? Because for 6 consecutive quarters, global demand has outpaced global supply. So for 6 quarters, the world has been cutting into its global reserves to meet demand, right? So it wasn't like it's a big shock that suddenly a drop in supply was going to create an economic tsunami. So they knew this was coming. And yet, in the State of the Union address, which occurred with the crisis, they've said nothing about actually improving domestic production at all, except to blame producers. And the answer that they came up with is, one is, let's buy oil from Iran. So this is largely another reason to have an Iran deal. So the administration's actually admitted at this point, there's actually no ability to do an Iran deal that would actually keep Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, which is the stated reason for the deal. But what an Iran deal would allow them to do is essentially buy Iranian oil. So that's a quick, cheap fix. Of course, the problem with that is, first of all, if you do an Iran deal, then essentially Iran's economy is open to the world, which means that every sanction that you put on Russia is literally meaningless because Iran can pretty much money launder everything the Russians do. So all your sanctions would be completely undermined. Plus, the Iranians would be flush with cash. They're going to use the cash to buy weapons from Russia, which is a cash cow for Putin, and which then they can use to threaten our friends and allies in the region. So that's a bad idea, and we'll see it with what happens. But there are other genius ideas. We'll buy oil from Venezuela, because most of you know, Venezuela has this very heavy oil. It's very difficult for most people to refine. The U.S. has refineries that can do that. We used to buy oil from Venezuela. We sanctioned them because of the genocidal policies of the government. And their thought was, this is genius because we will now buy oil from Venezuela. And what we will do is, because we offer to buy oil from them, they will improve their democratic practices, which of course is stupid because the last time we bought oil from them, they did nothing to improve their democratic practices. And Iran is the ally of, Venezuela is the ally of, wait for it, Iran, China, and Russia, right? So all you would be doing is making flush a government, essentially, which is a proxy for those countries in Latin America and would be a greater danger to us. So that's an equally bad idea. But yet this administration is so committed to the climate agenda that even though they have now triggered a world crisis in Ukraine because of their commitment to the climate agenda, they put 44 million people at risk, and every day we see people die and the most horrible atrocities because we refused to do the kinds of things that would deter Putin because of a climate agenda. Now they want to do anything but develop domestic energy. So they can't break from this political agenda. And I think this is the defining challenge in the next couple of years. This administration has just demonstrated that they can't give up on this idealized agenda that they know is physically impossible because the politics just don't allow them to do that.
Speaking of not giving up on that agenda, I'd like to ask you about this, Professor Guruswamy. I've heard from Jen Psaki and even from the president himself, they've said several times that if anything, this crisis should sort of hasten our move towards clean energy. The president even said that loosening environmental regulations or pulling back energy investments will not lower energy prices for families, but that transforming our economy to run on electric vehicles powered by clean energy, that will help.
This is what is called idiocy and stupidity on stilts. This is a high wire act of stupidity. And so let's get this. Let's just footnote to what he said. So here comes Mr. Biden and decides that he's going to cancel the Keystone pipeline, which is going to bring 800 million gallons of oil every day into Nebraska to go down to our refineries. Well, that is U.S. oil. At least that's Canadian oil. That Canada is a friend, unlike Maduro and the mullahs. The second thing he did was to hold back on these 9,000 permits. And earlier panels have dealt with this. So here is the problem. Is he actually negotiating with these two villainous people, or sets of people, the mullahs in Iran, who want the bomb, and it's going to be deferred by a month if the deal comes through, or Maduro, who's another terrible villain, and what is he going to negotiate with them for? The same damn oil that we could get from our own country. So he says, oh no, we are not going to get this oil, but we get it from Maduro because we like him, and from the mullahs because we like them too, because they're going to make a bomb that's going to bomb the rest of the world when they get it. But this just does not make any sense. And with regard to this whole thing, I just want to add one point about this so-called move to renewables. Now, one of the big thrusts of the move to renewables is to move to electric vehicles, right? And there is no doubt that electric vehicles do cut down on the emissions of carbon dioxide. But if you do a life cycle analysis where you look at where did all the material for creating this electric vehicle come from excavation to extraction to mining, you then begin to see that a different picture emerges, that the net energy going into an electric vehicle surpasses the energy that goes into an internal combustion engine. Also, there are a whole host of health problems associated with the minerals that go into the creation of the batteries and the electric vehicles, all of which we don't think about. And they're saying there's only one criteria on which you judge whether a car or a policy is legitimate or not. It is whether it lowers carbon dioxide. Yes, electric vehicles do help to lower carbon dioxide, but what about the whole medley of other issues that complicate this and make electric vehicles not such a great objective after all?
It seems so often when you hear these policy discussions in Washington, D.C., the context that you just laid out, that doesn't make it into the discussion. There's so many blinders on talking about, what actually comes out of the tailpipe, what is going to be the percentage in the end, and not looking at the entire picture. And I don't ask this to be glib, but the last time I checked, the president's limousine still ran on gas. And yes, Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg, occasionally he bicycles to work, but there are usually 2 or 3 SUVs with Secret Service behind them following him on his way. So I guess what I'm getting at here is, what should we make of sort of this almost religious zeal that some in government have towards this thought of, oh, well, we must have renewables, we must turn towards electric, despite some of the consequences we see on the world stage, despite the fact that if you look at not just one spreadsheet, but all of them, it perhaps doesn't actually cut emissions.
This is absolutely right. I think Bjorn gave a wonderful answer to this whole question. He said, if the choice is between renewables and fossil fuels, and the renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, yes, it's a no-brainer, let's go for it. But to get to that point, you have to invest a massive amount of resources in research into renewables so that they come up to the level of existing technologies that deal with hydrocarbons and fossil fuels. But the whole idea that we can stampede towards zero emissions by 2050 is going to lead to economic consequences, and it's going to make the people of this country, of whom I am a member, feel that, we are really being held ransom to these policies which have not, unfortunately, been thought through. And this is why I really appreciate the opportunity of being with people like you and the other amazing people who spoke here, because at least we are now hearing for the first time, or for me, a different voice, a voice of rationality that says, let's examine these issues and come to a decision based on what is rational. And I don't think that's...
I have a similar question for you, Professor Carafano, but I want to point out there's a gas station right next to the Heritage Foundation, and obviously it's not run or operated by those conservatives, but it's got the highest gas prices in D.C. And this morning, the cost of a regular gallon of gas was $5.19. And in D.C., nobody blinks. It doesn't really affect anyone's life in Washington, D.C. So I guess if you would hazard a guess, why is it that the people who are in brownstones or townhouses in Washington, D.C., they don't care about this as much in their personal lives as perhaps, someone who isn't inside of the Beltway?
Because it's a political agenda. And it's a political agenda which is, having now sold it as consensus, to walk away from it would be to destroy your own legitimacy. I just had this conversation with a bunch of Europeans who are now in the middle of this really, what's the Greek thing with the bad monster on one side and the bad monster on the other side? I can never, right? And they have no good choices here because they've so convinced their electorate that the green agenda is so important. They now can't go back to their electorate and say, oh, no, we're wrong. We actually need nuclear power and coal. They said we can't do that. And this goes back, and I think it's actually the only real value that, not that we're not valuable, but the one thing that we bring to this discussion, which we've never had today, which to understand the consequences of where they have taken us to. So if you go back, this started in the 1990s, right? And when America was, and the world was, we entered age of digitization, our economies were going, we were writing books calling it the end of history, right? We weren't gonna have great power competition anymore, we weren't gonna have bad people in the world. We were on this, jet into the future. And literally having a pristine climate was there was no cost for that, right? There were no trade-offs. It was just something we could do because it was nice to have. And after Al Gore lost the presidency, he didn't lose any weight, but he needed to do something, right? So he got this thing as like, look, I could be a rock star. I could be the global guy. I could write a book. I could do a documentary. And then people figured out, hey, this Al Gore thing, he is really onto something. Because what we can do is we can take this thing, which everybody likes anyway. He doesn't want to save the little blue dot. We can marry that to a political agenda to regain political power. And we have a winning that we can take into the future. And you know what? I'm fine with that. I get politics. I live in the city of politics. But here's the difference. This is not the 1990s. We are now facing in China the largest, most powerful destabilizing threat in the world. In Russia, we are facing a madman who is happy to replay the 1940s and not blink about it. And he will not stop until he is stopped. In Iran, we have a regime which is going to get a nuclear weapon. And when they get that nuclear weapon, they're going to use that to go on the offensive in the region. If you add these three things up together, this is as grave a threat to the freedom and prosperity of the future of the free world as we had in the Soviet Union. I mean, if there's one thing, this is a great group. If I got all my friends from Estonia and Germany and France and Taiwan and Italy and Japan and Sri Lanka and India and Australia, you know what? We would have lots of disagreements and lots of funny accents. But in the end of the day, we'd all say, you know what? We kind of like human rights. We kind of like freely elected governments. And we kind of like this free market thing. It's kind of cool. The Russians, the Chinese, but the Russians and the Chinese and the Iranians, they don't believe in any of those things. And they see them as actually obstacles to their future.
So can I?
And if we don't, I just want to finish, because if we don't
absolutely.
defend them, they will destroy them. And the point is the climate agenda is directly preventing, it's an obstacle to us doing the things we need to do to ensure that we are free and safe and prosperous, and we can defend ourselves against these people.
So I want to add that not only does the climate agenda do what you've just described, but it is also antithetical to global energy justice. Let me take a minute to explain why. As some of you have alluded to, there are over 1 billion people in the world. They live largely in sub-Saharan Africa and certain parts of Asia, who have no access to any energy at all for cooking. Like 3.5 million people die every year, women and children primarily. No access to energy for lighting, no access to energy for sanitation, which is important, and primarily no access to the poor women who bear the burden, the physical burden of running a household, cultivating the soil, bearing children, running businesses, no mechanical energy for them. Now, the UN has decided that everybody should have access to energy by 2030. That's Sustainable Development Goal 7, which our government says it subscribes to. But it doesn't, because if they keep insisting that the only energy that these poor people in the world can get is renewable energy, it's going to cost 50 times as much as moving into maybe a simple form of coal-powered generation or some kind of fossil fuels more easily accessible. So let's not take the high ground and say, oh my gosh, we are just riding this white horse and we are going to have energy based on fossil fuels, based on renewables, which is good for the world, and they keep saying good for the poorest in the world. That is absolutely incorrect. The poorest in the world need energy to live. They are dying. And to tell them, oh no, you can't have any energy unless it is renewable energy.
I'd like to ask you a quick follow-up, and it actually dovetails with one of the questions that was presented by someone in our audience. So I'll just reframe it slightly. What do you think one of these nations that is eager to go through industrialization, eager to improve their lot, what choice are they going to make if the West, if the United Nations and others come to them and say, the future is renewable? Meanwhile, you have China with their Belt and Road Initiative, who says, hey, if you would like to go through the industrialization that the rest of the world already has, lean into fossil fuels. What do you think that does for the route that they take?
I think that's a great question. So here is a nation. Let's take a nation in Africa. Let's take Sierra Leone, right? And because it also produced one of the great people who talk about this. But, you know, Kande Nuyumkela, who's an amazing guy. So now, you tell the impoverished people of Sierra Leone, you want to get out of poverty, you want to be able to cook fuels, you want to be able to have some form of lighting, you need to have some sanitation, particularly for women, you need some motive power for women and children to do the work that they are now doing and are dying as a result of exhaustion. And the only way that you can do that is through renewable energy. And then here comes our friendly Chinese guy and says to him or her or to the people there, hey, who cares about this? You know, you need energy, we'll give you energy. If you want us to build a power station, we build one every week, or 5 every week, or 5 every 2 weeks, I don't know. But we know how to build power plants. We will build a power plant for you, we can make it a coal-powered power plant, and you guys will prosper. So what do you think the rational answer of a person from a developing country would be? I would say, go with the fossil fuels that's going to get me out of poverty, that's going to get me out of ill health, that's going to help our people and education. So that's a great question.
So this is actually gets to a really important point. Because it's the other foreign policy disaster that climate agenda has driven us to. The climate agenda is based on 2 complete fallacies. One is that we're going to get China to cooperate with us. I don't know why people think that's funny.
It's funny.
But it is kind of funny, right? Because the Chinese came out and they said, you know, we have set very ambitious climate targets, and everybody said, oh, this is awesome. And then literally like the next day, the Chinese government came out and said, but of course we're not going to hit them. Right? But
that's what's funny.
So, you know, actually, we've been doing the index of economic freedom for 29 years, so next year will be our 30th year. One of the interesting correlations in the index is the wealthier a country is, the more the country invests in environmental stewardship. And so it kind of sets the obvious, easy answer is, if you want a pristine economy, just make everybody wealthier. Mm-hmm. So if you look at China, which is arguably, particularly if you look across the board, not just at greenhouse gases, but at every form of pollution, China is, without question, the world's largest polluter. If you look at the plastics in the ocean today, most of that comes from China. So China has the world's either first or second largest economy. But if you actually look at their level of economic freedom, it is incredibly low. And look at where the Chinese are going. I mean, even if you believe the Chinese numbers, which this is where you laugh, right? But even if you believe their numbers, they're in for a rough stretch of growth. And every day they are picking up new friction to that. So they're losing friends around the world. Their buddy Russia will now be at least a 30 or 40 or 50 $300 or $400 billion albatross around them, because even if the Russians successfully conquer Ukraine, they will take the entire Russian military to occupy that country, and they will have devastated it. And so instead of an asset, they will have to figure out how to feed 40 million starving people with zero infrastructure. So the Chinese are accumulating friction all the time to their economy, and their economy is slowing. And the notion that the Chinese are going to adapt or adopt renewable energy to power their economy is a lie. I mean, they're building coal plants faster than anybody else. And I guarantee you that 10 years from now, their energy consumption will be far dirtier than it is today. So, and without China, the notion that even the impossible target of 2050 was even possible is impossible. So and everybody knows that, and yet they talk as if this is something that's somehow going to happen. The second fallacy, which the professor talked to, is the other thing is the way they're going to deal with the developing world is wealth transfer. So the way they're going to skip into the environmentally pristine world is we're going to give them a bunch of money, and they're going to spend it on renewables, and then they're going to make a more rapid transition. Well, this only defies about 100 years of foreign assistance by the Western world. What we've seen is that wealth transfers to countries that are underdeveloped typically wind up slowing the development of those countries. It leads to more corruption, more inefficiency, it distorts markets, and the last thing it does is actually grow wealth. And then the notion that not only are we going to give them a bunch of money, which is guaranteed to actually not make those societies better, but demand that they spend that money in a way which will actually make the bad societies worse, is pretty awful. So I'll give you my favorite example, and I'll be quiet. My favorite country is Kosovo. Now, I know a lot of you are wondering why that, because in the 1990s, the Heritage Foundation actually opposed the liberation of Kosovo. And so ever since then, I've always felt really bad for these guys, and I've totally like tried to make it up with them. So actually, my first day on the job at Heritage, the first meeting I ever had was the ambassador from Kosovo came to me to yell at me because Kosovo was not in the Index of Economic Freedom and that we didn't recognize that they existed as a country. And I felt awful. I said, oh, well, we don't have any data on Kosovo, but I'll tell you what we'll do. I will recognize you as a real country. And then we say, here's what you have to do to start collecting data, and then we can actually measure your economy, which they did, good for them. But the one challenge that Kosovo has always had is, even though they are self-sufficient in coal, they have a really old coal-fired plant, and it's very inefficient. And most people in Kosovo warm their homes with coal, right? It is. So if you've already been in the old Soviet Union, you remember going in and this really acrid smell in the air because people are burning coal, what that smells like. Because Kosovo still smells like that in the wintertime. And so what they wanted to do is to build a modern coal-fired plant. And that would have done two things. One is it would have been more efficient than their old coal-fired plant. The other thing is because like 90% of the population of Kosovo lives in the capital of Pristina, with the waste heat from the power plant, they could have powered every home in Pristina, which meant that nobody would have to burn coal in their homes anymore. So if you really were interested in CO2 gas reductions, building this modern coal plant would have been a tremendous boom to this tiny little country. Here we are 20 years later, and they are still with the same coal, because the EU refused to allow the funding of a coal-fired plant. And actually, they just voted down a natural gas pipeline, because that wasn't green enough. So here's Kosovo is basically stuck with the same energy solution they had 20 years ago, which is completely environmentally horrible. And it's because it's not what they want. And this is unsustainable, right? And this country is sitting next to Serbia in the middle of the Balkans, which is highly destable, and it's not part of NATO. And it's very likely one of the next places Putin would go for aggressive act. But rather than spending the last 20 years making these people more economically resilient, more energy secure, more prosperous, so they could better resist naked aggression by Putin, we've actually had them languishing in energy poverty because they can't power the country with green solar panels from China.
I'd like to get to audience questions here in a minute, but I'm going to do something that's kind of dangerous, which is ask a hypothetical. And President Biden, he likes to say that we are in the middle of this great contest, which is between autocracy and democracy. And you can substitute whether it's the Chinese or the Russians. There are plenty of folks who aren't the United States friends around the world. But I'm curious what either of you think would have happened if, on the world stage, what would have happened if, after the invasion of Ukraine, if President Biden had walked into the White House briefing room and he said then and there that the United States was just going to go full throttle when it came to domestic production, that he was going to rescind regulations designed to curb production, and that he was going to expedite leasing and permits. And then maybe if he extrapolated that also out to some of the relationships that we have with these other countries abroad, urging them to, not be ashamed to use fossil fuels. What kind of environment do you think that we would be in currently, not just in Ukraine, but the world over?
I think an environment that is wonderful to imagine, but is never going to happen. Because what the fellow said, the president said was, he's going to stay with net zero emissions. And in that context, if you give me a minute, I'd like to point out to some of the culprits behind this kind of thinking that is generating what the president said. I'm going to read this because I can't say it better than what this fellow said. One of the reasons we are in this predicament is because we have become captive to what Isaiah Berlin, who's an amazing public philosopher on the left, called the secular priesthood. The priests of our secular society, he says, we have created a new class of rulers and regulations to whom the rest of society remains subservient. With the religious priesthood, while the religious priesthood of old justified its control based on spiritual dogma, the secular priesthood bases much of its power on the reading of quote-unquote science as dogma. It is like like its medieval counterpart, the secular priesthood has adopted a role as an enforcer not of free thought, but of progressive orthodoxy. Yeah. Mitigation like net zero emission by 2050, calling for drastic reductions of global greenhouse gases, creates and propagates centralized power among this elite. And one of the things that was pointed out by, I want to close with this, I can't help seeing, was Michael Crichton or Michael Crichton. I'm a first-generation guy here, so I don't know how to pronounce C-R-I-C-H-D. Is it Crichton or Crichton? Crichton. Oh, right.
That's why he's dead.
Yeah, he's dead. He can hear us, though. He's the Jurassic Park guy, you know? And Michael Crichton said that he compared the ardent advocacy for global warming to the zealous advocacy of an earlier scientific theory. You've got to hear this guy out. The theory quickly drew enormous support from leading scientists, politicians, and celebrities around the world during the first part of the 20th century. Research advancing this theory was funded by distinguished philanthropies and carried out by prestigious universities. Similar to global warming, this theory, avidly reported and propagated by the media, was pursued in order to avoid a potentially tragic crisis. The science of this theory was taught in schools and universities. Its supporters included the most eminent and distinguished in the world: Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Winston Churchill. It was approved by the Supreme Court Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Louis Brandeis, two icons, who ruled in favor of cases decided by them. And other famous names included Alexander Graham Bell, inventor of the telephone, the president of the National it goes on, and Margaret Sanger, the famous founder of Planned Parenthood, who wrote that, you know, you had got to prevent the kind of theory that required people to take action. And what was the theory? It was the theory of eugenics. Eugenics postulated a crisis of the gene pool leading to the distortion of the human race. The best humans were not breeding as rapidly as the inferior ones. The foreigners, the immigrants, the Jews, the degenerates, the unfit and the feeble-minded. This view was adopted by science-minded Americans who treated these people as dangerous human pests. And Margaret Sanger, whose arguments were adopted by Hitler, so said that the fostering the good for nothing at the expense of the good is an extreme cruelty. There is no greater curse to posterity than the bequeathing to them of an increasing population of imbeciles. She spoke of the burden of caring for the dead. So what Crichton did was said, you know, here was this amazing eugenics theory adopted by these amazing people, you know, highest intellectuals in the world. What's the difference between that and global warming? And Michael Crichton, great guy, he saw this as being two peas in the same pod. And he said, global warming is wanting to revolutionize our thinking, forget about our energy security, forget about global poverty, forget about the position of the United States in the world. Just like eugenics is wanting to change people and don't breed half-castes and Jews and brown guys like me and all that kind of stuff. But wait, so I just want to say that this secular priesthood, this is not my term. You know, this is Isaiah Berlin, who's a formidable public intellectual. He coined this and said, these are the guys who are making these, helping Biden and crowd to make some of these decisions.
What made that a danger was not an idea, but it was an idea that became a dogmatic political agenda.
Correct.
And so,
correct.
You know, the answer to your question is why democracies can't compete with authoritarian regimes is when the democracies start acting like the totalitarian regimes. So thank you. So, not to be outdone, George Kennan, contemporary of Isaiah Berlin, wrote this thing, The Long Telegram. None of you are old enough to remember that except me. Fine. So he wrote it in the embassy in Moscow. It became the foundation for what became the strategy for winning the Cold War, kind of the theory of containment, of how we were going to hold off the Soviet Union, without actually fighting a war with them. Everybody remembers containment. What nobody pays attention to is the last 300 words of The Long Telegram, which arguably are by far the most important. And it was the ones that we hewed the closest to that actually made the difference. Because in the end, we never really contained the Soviet Empire. We outcompeted the Soviet Empire. It was a marathon, and we kept running, and they just collapsed. And the last 300 were, I don't remember exactly what it was, but it's like, look, he goes, we're going to win this. He goes, we have every advantage. God's on our side, religion, economy, democracy. He says the only way we can lose is if in the process of competing with the enemy, we become the enemy. And so when you see Joe Biden reflexively implement a political agenda and then dogmatically use every force of government to drive it forward, regardless of the consequences it has on Americans and its friends and its allies, and really the fate of the people on the planet, it's hard to be more authoritarian than that. And that's why we're in danger of losing.
Dr. Carafano, I'd like to ask a follow-up from someone in the audience. It's a great question. It has to do with the geopolitics that would result from a transition towards electric vehicles. The idea being that if you suddenly cut off the supply of oil and no longer had to go to Iran or to Saudi Arabia or Venezuela or some of these unfriendly regimes, you would still, in all likelihood, have to be dependent on some other unfriendly regimes like China for the rare earth minerals that we need to power those batteries. What do you see that kind of geopolitics looking like?
No, the reality is, this is one of the fallacies of the many fallacies of the administration, and one of their many glib, which they have to know is a lie. It does not matter what the price of oil goes to. It does not matter how much gas causes a gallon. If renewables cannot replace that, you can't fight. So you can't fight the physics and the chemistry of that. So it doesn't matter, right? There is no break point on the price of energy that allows for this magic transition to happen because physics and chemistry and basic economics are there. So I gotta tell you the story, it's really true, because if you believe that, it is like, how can people really believe this stuff? So I was on a scientific committee, and we were being briefed by a general who was explaining about something called the autonomous brigade. So this was an idea. The Army was way ahead of being green and way ahead of being woke. They were gonna create a brigade that was completely energy autonomous. It would create all its own everything, all its own fuel, all its everything. And wouldn't this be awesome? Because you could deploy these things and then never have to resupply them. And so he's briefing the I was the only non-scientist there. I was like the diversity hire. So he's briefing them, and he's going through these great PowerPoint slides, really awesome PowerPoint slides. So he's going through the slides, and then our chair, who was like a Nobel physicist guy, he goes, "Hey," he goes, "General," this is with all due respect, he goes, "I've just been sitting here, kind of doing a little back of the envelope here," and he said, "What you just described to us defies the laws of physics." And the general kind of blinked, and he said, "Is that a problem?" But I think, again, I think there's one great takeaway of this particular panel and the brilliant comments from the professor. It's that this is creating. It's not just about, we've had lots of discussions about the fallacy of doing this and what it could do to our economy. This is creating the conditions for global instability and global crisis and war. And the frustrating thing is, what we've learned throughout the whole day is that the problem here is politics. It's not that we don't have the economy, we don't have the people, we don't have resources, we don't have technology to move forward. The problem is people are making political decisions that defy the laws of physics and science and chemistry and economics, and we are not stopping them. And I do want to get this in before, because the one thing that I think is really important that is the importance of you guys and the nature of the conservative movement and how that's changed. Conservatism, when it rose to power in the 80s, was fusionism. We had, evangelicals and national security conservatives and physical conservatives, and there were like 12 environmental conservatives that lived in it like a commune of and we all just voted for the same people. Right, but everybody kind of did their thing. It's like a great buffet table. Like somebody would go up and say, give me a serving of pro-life and a little low taxes, and then maybe sprinkle on some voter integrity on there, and I'm done. Really, I'm full. I can't. And we have to stop thinking that way, because all these issues impact all our lives. So proud of Steamboat really to do this, because you think of this as a domestic, but it's not. I mean, and energy really is a global issue. And I think to me the great takeaway is we are only going to survive if we get beyond the buffet mentality. And if conservatives understand that we have to care about all these things, and that we have to take responsibility for tending our garden, and our garden really is this American nation. And if we don't get in there and care about all these issues across the spectrum of social, political, and economic, military, and foreign policy issues, the garden is not going to thrive. And the fact that you guys would have a panel on foreign policy and how it impacts on this domestic agenda, I think really shows that Steamboat is very cutting edge in understanding that the broadening of the responsibility of the conservative movement to understand the breadth of issues that are impacting our freedom and prosperity is so important. So
I want to get one more question in here before our time comes to a close. It's from the audience, and I think this is a good wrap up because it has to do with political decision making as well as in this country as well as the world stage. The questioner asks, the World Bank has refused to invest in fossil fuel plants in developing countries. That strikes me as a form of neo-colonialism. I'm wondering if either of you would like to react to that quickly as our time comes to a close. The idea being that there are some in this country who have the luxury of being able to look down their nose on others as they try to move forward.
I think it's neo-colonialism, it's patronizing, and it's something that the World Bank ought never to be venturing into. They are supposed to support economic ventures that help to improve the economic condition, and to say we're not going to give money for projects that involve fossil fuels is really grossly outside their remit. And I do not think that, and I do think that when there's a change of administration, that we have to change the World Bank head, which is usually a US appointee, and make sure that the right policies are made.
So here we are at the dawn of the 21st century, and actually we are facing a battle of the new imperialists. I mean, I wouldn't say it's neo-colonialist. I mean, if you look at Chinese strategy, it's functionally imperialist. I mean, it's functionally no different than the great imperialist powers of the 18th or 19th century. If you look at Russian strategy, it is just naked conquest of the most brutal form of imperialism. And if you look at what Iran, what the mullahs would like to do, it is no different. And we cannot fight that with essentially neo-imperialism of imposing on the rest of the world our concepts of not just of green energy, but of gender and a whole other range of social and cultural political norms that we think we need to impose on everybody else. We can only fight against evil with freedom. And until we do that, not just their future, but the survival of the free world is greatly imperiled. And the tragic thing is, as we sit here today, the greatest threat is not what China and Russia and Iran may do. It's what we're doing to the instruments of the free world that will allow us to protect ourselves.
Well, gentlemen, this has been a very broad, a very general, and a very interesting conversation. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you very much. That was greatly done. Thank you.